Hi, my name is Lucy Huxley. I'm a whore, and welcome to my bedroom. Today, I am joined by Sienna Carlisle. Thank you so much for being here, Sienna.
My pleasure.
Sienna Carlisle is an international trans goddess whose journey has spanned many countries and many parts of the industry. She is a luxury companion as well as a dom, depending on the dynamic at hand. So, Sienna, the first question I want to ask, the classic, how did you get into doing sex work? What is your origin story?
My origin story is quite elaborate. So,
Give it to me.
it was the first time that I downloaded Grindr,
Mm-hmm.
and I was just like inundated with messages. I was like probably 20 years old or 19 or something like this at the time. And I didn't really know how to respond to them, but I invited this guy over and I was just like, who is this guy? Because I'm obviously like a trans woman. Meeting people who were like really into that was like kind of a novelty for me. It was like kind of before I guess the trans like social media thing had like really taken off. It was like just as Instagram was starting. So
Mm.
I was just like curious and I invited him over and he was just like a weird guy. And I was like, oh, you should go now after I interviewed him for a little bit. But then he was like, oh, can you give me a lap dance or something like this? And I was like, well, how much money do you have in your wallet? That was kind of how I started. That was kind of my first
that
exchange.
How did that thought of like how much money do you have in your wallet come to your head? Was it just like a spontaneous thing or?
Yeah, I guess it was just like this high pressure situation where I had just been sort of curious and he was just like very horny. And I was like, how do I make sense of this situation? How do I make
Mm-hmm.
this I didn't want to like completely disengage, but I also knew that like doing anything with him erotically would be betraying myself. And I was like young, like at university, I was broke. Like it was kind of a way of also just making it kind of more intelligible.
Like, what can I get out of this situation? Maybe.
Yeah, well, it was also kind of a relief for him. I found he was able to engage with me and I was able to give him some time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was actually really fun. Like I
Nice.
did it to La Vie en Rose by Grace Jones.
Perfect selection.
Yeah, he was just like giving me compliments the whole time. I knew it was something that I could do
Hmm.
in the future.
So after that,
Mm.
did you have like curiosity to do sex work further, or was there like a bit of a lull period before you started doing it
Definitely.
professionally?
Actually, now that I think about it, I knew sex workers like at the time, so I think this was a bit more normalized. I started in BDSM first.
Hmm.
So I did an apprenticeship at a dungeon in Sydney, and that's where I learned traditional BDSM.
That's another thing I wanted to
Mm.
ask you about because you say that you're like classically trained in BDSM. What is that for someone who doesn't know anything about BDSM or pro-doms? What does classically trained mean?
Yeah, I think that's an Australian term, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think obviously we're anti-hierarchy. But yeah, I think that's like a term that's used in Australia, like that you would call it like classic domination. If someone asks that, I kind of know what they mean. I'm not sure whether it exists. I'm sure it does because it's like kind of a generic phraseology in other countries, but classic domination, it's just because there were houses in Australia, whereas I think in the US and in the UK, those were illegal. So
Yeah.
the traditions were really broken there. And so this apprenticeship model still kind of survived to some extent and still does survive in Australia, where you're passing on these kind of technical skills that it can be very dangerous if you do them incorrectly. So I learned all that. I didn't have like a full, like I didn't learn a lot of medical play and stuff, but I learned the basic of classic domination.
And what, for people
Mm.
who are listening who don't know what the basics of domination, could you just give like a brief overview of what that includes?
For me, it's like just holding the situation. So
Mm.
holding this mistress and like slave situation. And often the guy is like on the floor. That to me is the classic domination. And it can involve like training, bondage, maybe some punishment. Doesn't necessarily have to be super painful, but
Hmm.
it's just about those roles.
Like the
Yeah.
power dynamic.
Hmm.
So I guess like your training involves also learning a lot about the psychological side of things, not just the physical side of things. Or
Yeah, that was like the hardest thing when I first started, which is like holding that narrative together. Now it kind of feels second nature.
and do you feel learning how to do that has impacted other areas of your life outside of work? Has it helped you in other ways, or is it really just about the work for you?
Oh, well, it's helped me just with vanilla stuff, I would
Mm-hmm.
say.
Yeah.
One of the mistresses who trained me at the beginning, she said to me something I'll never forget, which was she was like, what we do is the suspension of disbelief. So the things you do in the room would seem ridiculous in normal life or in normal interactions. And so part of your job as the dom is to kind of do these kind of really extra things, say these really extra things, and you have to sell it. You have to make it seem realistic. And
Mm-hmm.
it is realistic. It's true in that moment. I guess it's like how sex is like a space that you go to. I think Esther Perel says that. We're ourselves, but we're in this different space where suddenly like dirty talk or something, it makes a bit more sense. And that's kind of what BDSM is. And that
Mm-hmm.
whole role play thing is just another kind of dirty talk where things are heightened.
And things that you wouldn't say in normal life
Yeah,
can make sense in this
but things that
situation.
are true for you and just in your normal life.
Yeah, it's like a place to be able to express things that you can't in
Hmm.
day-to-day life. Like most people cannot express their desire to submit to somebody in that degree in their day-to-day life or have power over somebody.
Definitely.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about, which you already mentioned with the differences in dungeons compared to Australia and other
Yeah.
places, is what differences have you found working as a sex worker in Australia versus Europe? Because you spend half of the year here in Europe and the other half of the year in Australia, right?
Yeah, I would say more like a quarter in Australia
Okay.
now, but
Okay.
that's true.
So I'm curious what the differences are in sex work compared to Australia and Europe, both practically, what the differences are, and also culturally, what the differences are that you encounter.
There's so many differences. I feel like the workers' rights movement has been so much more successful in Australia. Is that surprising to you to hear that, or you know that? You're quite well read, so
Yeah, I'm aware of it. Sex work is legal in all of Australia, right? And
yeah,
it's decriminalized in certain places. Yeah,
exactly.
so there's much better legal protections for most sex workers. Whereas in
Yeah,
Europe, here in Germany, it's legal, but it's not decriminalized. A lot of countries use the Nordic model.
totally.
It's not as good in that sense.
Yeah, so it kind of feels like going back in time a little bit if you're
Mm,
just coming from Australia to Europe or the UK to work. And it was only decriminalized in Australia across most states more recently. There's some parts of Australia that's still criminalized, like in South
mm-hmm.
Australia. But yeah, definitely, I don't know. I think there must have been something that happened in like the 80s and 90s. I've heard kind of some stories about literal strikes and stuff happening in King's Cross and just like other stories, which are kind of a bit more colorful. The culture around it is really different. Like, I think
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot more respect for the work. Just like the average Joe Blow who would come and book a sex worker or the average sex worker. I think blowjobs with condoms are normal in
Mm.
brothels.
Oh, that's so nice.
Yeah, so that's not the case in the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah, here it's like blowjobs without condoms are the
Yeah,
norm, which
and
is
so
really
it's just things
unfortunate.
like that. And obviously the rates are higher. That's also because people have more money in Australia, just like
Mm-hmm.
average people. It's hard to say because I think my experience is very unique as well. And I'm very much in the privileged realm of work now and at the high end. I would also say, like, about Australia is that there's a lot of migrant sex workers where there's a double standard. The mainstream brothels or mainstream of sex work also has this flip side of migrant workers without rights. And so even though it's decriminalized in Australia, the borders are still criminalized.
The
So,
immigration is still criminalized, so if someone is there not legally or without a work visa, like their work
mhm.
is still illegal.
Yeah, and so I think the working standards for women or whoever in that situation, it's like very different. I guess that's the qualification for my blanket statements
Yeah.
about Australia. And it's also just like the limits of what I've been exposed to. White woman with citizenship and working
Yeah.
rights.
Why do you think first time clients who have never been with a trans woman before, why do you think that they are seeking you out? Or what do they tell you about why they are seeking you out or why they want to book with you?
First timers with trans girls, it's an interesting concept. I think that concept is really hyped up in the culture to be a first timer. And guys will come to you to say that as well. And honestly, I'm not sure what it means these days because a trans woman could literally be anything and look like anything. And lots of the time, people also mislead you as to what they have and haven't done previously.
Mm-hmm.
Or they make a big deal out of it when it's my experience is that it's like sex with a trans woman is something that is like a coherent part of straight male sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that happens very intuitively and without a hitch. I think just like this whole concept of first timers, it's more of this thing that is built up around, it's almost like a virginity or something, where
Mm-hmm.
it's
Yeah.
like, okay, but like the physiology of that's not a thing. And I don't know. It's hard to know why people get obsessed with trans girls. But my experience is most of the men that come to me are not obsessed with trans girls. This is like one slice of their sexuality. They're in differing levels of acceptance about.
I guess that can cause some issues with clients if they're not fully accepting of that part or of accepting
Yeah.
of like their desires. Do they often end up projecting that onto you or?
Sometimes, I guess when I was younger, I've had experiences like that of just complete nerves or like building it up as though it's like some big deal. But most of the time these days, I kind of feel like the people who approach me, they're like familiar with my online presence. I'm definitely more than like a basic trans girl to experiment with. Of course, I get people wanting to experiment, but it's like people who have a little bit of nuance around this. And
Mm,
because I offer kink as well, there's lots of different avenues to experiment. Sometimes people will message me and be like, I'm a first timer. And I'm like, to trans girls, to booking an escort, to BDSM, to
mm-hmm. Do you find that first timers, whether that's to BDSM or being with a trans girl or seeing an escort, do you find them to be more work or maybe sometimes like more rewarding in some ways or a mix of the two?
it depends really.
Mm-hmm.
I've had experiences where people send me emails or book me and then they cancel because of nerves. This is like one or two over the last many years. I think first timers, there's no difference for me. Some people are just, it's like some people just know what they're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, if they know what they want, for me, I find that helps the most with clients. If they know what they want, that makes my job so much easier.
Yeah, and it's sex. It's not that hard. It's kind of like neutral.
But yeah, it should be if you're relaxed and comfortable, which I'm sure
Yeah.
you're good at making
I
your
mean,
clients feel,
yeah, I mean, there's
you
just
know?
like something just pushing you further
Uh,
already internally. Personally, my best experiences are with people that just treat me like a woman. And that makes the most sense to me. When you're coming with that point of view, it just feels like the situation's not interrupted at all by
mm-hmm.
these false perceptions.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
fantasies that they have in their head about
Yeah.
whatever.
I guess there is a category for people who have like homosexual feeling. I'm not sure whether I see many people like that. I guess within the whole field of trans, I mean, you could say the industry, but I think just like the transsexual field, there's definitely some people who maybe would want to use trans girls as like a gateway to being with men. But
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I've only had one sub ever who was like that. And she was a cross-dresser and then ended up seeing like male escorts after. But this is like one that I've like, ever heard of. The idea that those people exist or those people are seeing me is so big in people's assumptions
Mm-hmm.
about what goes on. But yeah, I would say by and large, it's just like straight guys. It's like a part of straight guys' sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't even say bi.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes sense. And I guess dealing with some of those intricacies is one difficulty that you might face that as a cis escort I don't face. Are there other difficulties that you face being trans that cis escorts in a similar price range wouldn't face?
Yeah, I mean, comparing myself to cis women within the industry, I just think to be a trans girl, you just have to work so much fucking harder in terms of getting taken seriously. There's good things and there's bad things because I know that I've got a niche and I'm differentiated. Like I never have to worry about that because yeah, I don't know anyone who's got a similar kind of thing to me. I would love to meet them. There's actually one girl that I know that I've just started messaging with who's like in the States who's kind of similar vibe. And one in the UK, but they're just also different people. So yeah, I feel like I definitely have a niche.
Mm-hmm.
But when I compare myself to cis peers, I just feel like there's a lot of double standards. And it's been hard to kind of create a space for myself with what I wanted to do. And it's also why I kind of took steps away from just being a dominatrix because
Mm-hmm.
it's like actually a huge question. Like, how does being trans affect your working experiences? One part of it would be this whole trans demeanor thing. I've got a
Mm-hmm.
lot to say about that.
Can you
Um,
get into that a little bit more? What do you mean by the trans demeanor?
no, demeanor,
Oh, domina. Okay.
or dom. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the demeanor,
Yeah, I was like,
the trans demeanor. Well, I think that the archetype of the dominatrix is this is controversial, but it's like a woman who's castrated and wields phallic power.
I like that.
Yeah. So this is just like full psychoanalytic interpretation of it, but this is not my belief. This is, I think, the porny male gaze interpretation of what a dom is.
Yes.
And it's a woman who wields phallic power. And a part of what a woman is a woman who does not have a phallus,
Mm-hmm.
does not have phallic power. And so I think as a trans dom, you're put in a situation where it's like the whole fetish of the dominatrix is kind of interrupted by your anatomy. If you actually have a phallus, if you actually have a dick and you're not just wearing a strap on, it kind of creates something that is like quite threatening to
Mm-hmm.
men with a simplistic or a misogynistic view of what women are.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, that was something that I came up against again and again as I was being in traditional classic domination, was that I was not asked to do a lot of the technical stuff, and often my body was always in play. And also I felt like this pressure, like a dominatrix is also famously covered up and
Mm-hmm.
off limits. And that element was never kind of accessible to me as a trans woman.
Yeah, that makes sense. Traditionally, dominatrixes are they're covered up or they wear strap-ons, and
Hmm.
clients or submissives don't really touch their genitals. But as a trans
Yeah.
woman, you're using your genitals more than a cis
Yeah.
woman would in this work. Yeah.
And like face sitting and pussy worship is so big as well. I think
Mm-hmm.
there's also like the spectacle of the covered up groin area with domination.
Mm,
And when I started, I guess, just like going through that process of being like, well, I'll never be able to be the top dominatrix or something. Like, not that I needed to be that, but I think it was almost like a glass ceiling, a
yeah.
leather ceiling.
Yeah. Yeah, transparent latex ceiling. I love it.
Yeah, just kind of realizing that there was all these limitations put on the role I could play. It also interrupts like this power, which is the whole point of being a dominatrix,
Hmm.
like this exaltation. And so it led me into more erotic stuff. I think it's also who I am. Like my arm candy vibe is quite strong.
Like, I
And
deserve to be a trophy wife, but only for an hour at a time.
I literally just kept getting asked to dinner. I just started kind of doing more of that, and there was no limit on me in terms of what, like the amount of erotic stuff that I wanted to do because I stopped comparing myself to cis dominatrices
Hmm.
and I started leaning into the eroticism and also understanding that in my advertising I needed to be quite exposed because that's the other thing is like full frontal nudity is so expected of trans women online in the industry,
Hmm.
almost like a verification. And I think also having your face out is a huge,
Mm,
like being face in as a trans woman is not a viable option.
true. I never even thought about that.
Yeah.
I'll just mention for people who are listening who don't know that being face in refers to not showing your face online anywhere or on your ads. And being face out means that you show your face.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that makes sense. So that
Yeah.
would be
It's
a
like almost
requirement.
like it's almost like the clientele, they want to verify that you're feminine enough, that they want to also verify that your body exists and literally like what your dick looks like. Whereas cis women in advertising and online, they cannot show their face and they cannot be doing like pussy pics.
Yeah, we can get away with showing so little. There's so many women online
Yeah.
who don't show their faces and they also just show themselves wearing like fairly covering lingerie, and that's it. Yeah.
So there's that. And then the other thing is that the rates, there's like a gender pay gap that's trans and cis. Because if you start thinking about the amount of exposure that is expected of trans women, there's also the amount of work literally done to the body. It's like having had plastic surgery of some sense. It's like an investment.
Yes.
But also, like when you're doing a booking, most trans women in the industry are expected to bottom and also top on a whim with no discussion. And
that's intense.
yeah. Yeah. And so that's also like definitely a pressure that's been put on me and put on other girls. I guess a lot of this stuff, it's stuff that I have navigated, but I no longer feel pressurized by because I can handle it for whatever reason, or I found ways of making this rewarding for myself. But it was a learning curve. And I think other trans women entering the industry or in it currently, they know what I'm talking about. Like doing anal is like a huge time and physical commitment. And cis women can charge more for it.
Yeah, it's an upcharge for us. It's like an extra add-on. Yeah.
And a lot of also trans girls, they can't top without medication.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
of hormones. And
Yes.
so you might be douching and then also taking like some sort of erection support medication. It's like an added physical toll. And so it's
Yeah.
like you wonder why trans women in the industry are so marginalized. And a lot of people get lost in this world as well. It's really heavy when you think about it. And when I meet or I'm exposed to some of my peers online, I think I've been very fortunate in this industry and I've been able to like find a lot of success in it. And I have really good conditions for myself, but it can be quite heavy.
Yeah.
Think about transphobia within the industry coming from peers and also clients.
Do you experience transphobia from peers a lot, or have you in the past?
Definitely. Yeah. When I started in a dungeon, I actually started working in a dungeon because I had a friend who worked reception and she suggested I come interview. And so that's how I started. And we talk about that time now. And she described it as just like transphobia vibes. And I think I was really young, and the things that I was put through as an apprentice mistress in an all cis workplace, as the only trans dom there, was very intense. And I think if you talk to other people who've worked in traditional houses, there's a hazing thing for new apprentices, and it's a hard thing to navigate. But the good element of that I feel like I have taken through the rest of my career is even though it was difficult being alongside cis women and being excluded or being put in really intense situations where I'm like walking in as the only trans girl into an intro and the client saying weird things, yeah, or being surprised or whatever. Yeah, I guess the good thing that I took from that was like that being in this cis-led, cis-dominated workplace, I had much better working conditions than I knew about from like friends of mine who are in just like vanilla sex work, much safer and much higher rates because I was obviously on the same rates as everyone else there.
Because you were working in like this established dungeon.
Yeah, and they would charge more for body worship. And because almost every session I did had body worship, I was getting more for sessions.
So you got to have the same rates as a cis woman for that.
Because it was standardized.
Yeah, whereas if you worked in like a dungeon where it was trans woman only, I don't know if those exist. But if that were to exist, if that were to happen, you wouldn't have been able to get those rates.
Exactly. And it just gave me this level of entitlement because I saw these men who wanted to see me like paying. And that was a lesson for the rest of the industry because the rest of my career, I've just been seeing what cis girls are doing. And literally in a feminist way, I've been like, well, that's the standard I'm working with. And I think part of the reason why I've been able to find success in this is because I've been putting myself alongside cis women and insisting on being in cis women's advertising and workspaces and emulating or aligning myself with their branding and their online presence. And it's led to me being positioned in a way that instead of getting these people who are really in this trans sex work world where it can be quite wild and gnarly and risky, I've avoided that almost like entirely.
Mm-hmm.
And it's worked. And it's because I was alongside cis girls in that initial moment. And
Mm-hmm.
actually, the dungeon was just to like kind of round out that narrative. The dungeon was like, it was really challenging, but you know, at the end of that time, it closed shortly after I left and I moved to the UK. At the end of that time, I was getting picked over the cis girls I was working with, and not many people were getting bookings. And I just remember like those last few months when we were doing intros with people who just walked in and I was getting picked over like the cis girls, and the guy hadn't even come in specifically for that to see me or anything. I remember one of my peers saying, well, if he wanted that, he should have just said so we didn't all get dressed and go up and meet him. And that's like quite funny, but
It is. It's crazy because she would have never said that if it was about like a different preference. Like if he
exactly.
only wanted like tall girls or like girls with big butts, she wouldn't have made that
Yeah,
comment.
exactly. I sort of knew that something was working and I could kind of hold my own.
So I guess that was the beginning of you being able to differentiate yourself. And something you've written on your website is that women like you are incredibly hard to find or something similar, which has also been my experience just looking at other sex workers online, like on ad websites or on social media. Like you've mentioned, there are very few trans women like you, not just in Europe,
Yeah.
but also in other places. Do you think that's mostly just because of the experiences you've had that have enabled you to differentiate yourself? Or like, why are there so few trans women who brand themselves the way that you do and to do the type of work that you do?
I think I'm a specific kind of person.
Yeah. Yeah. There's only one of you.
Yeah, so there's that. But it's just like what I said just now, that I guess I was coming from a place where I was looking at what women and cis women in particular who were doing well in this field, how they were kind of navigating it, coming from that place as opposed to these like specific trans like advertising sites where it's a different vibe.
Hmm.
And I guess that's why I'm more on your radar. And it's also authentic to me because how do I even describe this world that like most trans women in the sex industry? But it's like how in Australia, there's one world for people with citizenship, which is like racialized, obviously, but it's like not all white people, but it's like people with working rights. And then there's like a migrant sex work world with specific brothels and stuff. And it's just like a different tradition or something.
Mm,
And when you're taught, like everyone's taught to some extent how to be in the industry, how to advertise.
even just by observing other people
Yeah,
online, like that's how a lot of people learn.
exactly. And often you'll have a friend who tells you where to advertise, what sort of pictures to get, how much to charge. And I was careful and deliberate when I started, because also I was looking at these trans websites like TS for Rent, for example, or like shemales.com or whatever. Like these like kind of things that I was like, this is crazy.
Yeah, yeah, just the names alone.
Yeah. And even just looking at like some of the pictures and some of the text, and I'm just like, that sounds really intense to me. And over the years, sometimes I've had people book me who come from that world, and it's always a bad time.
Mm,
I mean, things I'll say about what I'm speaking about, and this is also no judgment on anyone who's in a situation like this, but for me, it's like high risk and effort, and just not where I'm at personally with what I want to be offering. But like in this world, there's like a lot of drugs.
hmm.
There's a lot of kind of like more risky sexual practices, more kind of messy, I would say, even more kind of
Mm-hmm.
like messy bookings. It's like just like more high risk, more drugs, lower rates, more for less. And this is like a function of transphobia where that kind of was the only option for a lot of trans women for a long time.
Yeah, and still it's like the main option for trans women, I
It's the main
guess. Yeah.
option.
Yeah.
Yeah. Obviously, I'm coming to this with a lot of education and a lot of like friends who like aren't trans and in different parts of the industry. And I started in BDSM, but I did have to work hard to differentiate myself and carve out a space where it's normalized to be kind of safe and also have a human connection and to be, as you put it, professional.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so going back to what you said, that you have had experiences where you have clients who are used to seeing other trans workers who are more in like the world that you mentioned, and then when they come to you, it's not a great experience for you because maybe they're expecting something more like what is offered in that world.
Yeah, because I think there's a specific sort of client who likes to go to the lower price end
Mm-hmm.
and into this more kind of high risk world. And even if they have money,
Mm-hmm.
so it's kind of like just this thing where it's like wild or crazy or yeah, like risky and escapist.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say risky, I mean in terms of like sexual health or even physical health. Yeah,
Yeah.
like with drugs and stuff.
Yeah.
I guess we have to face it. That's a big part of the industry as well.
Yes.
Yeah,
For all types of workers, it
all
is. It is a
types.
big part of the industry.
Yeah.
You recently did a rebrand. Could you explain what a rebrand is in sex work for people who don't know?
Oh, I love that you were here for the rebrand.
I didn't actually see your whole rebrand process, but you did mention to me that you had recently done a rebrand. So
Oh, I
that's how
mentioned
I
it to
know.
you. Okay,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah, I didn't witness the whole process.
So I changed my name in April and I had like more of a dominatrixy name before.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I just outgrown it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So rebrand is just, I guess, when you change your name.
Yeah, change your name and I guess getting new photos and
Yeah, you do it with a photo set normally.
and just positioning yourself like in a new way. Like you're
Exactly.
not just changing your name for no reason. It's also to
Changing your copy as well, like the
yes,
little blurb, your bio.
how you market yourself, like your whole branding.
Yeah, I guess for me, it was also something that happened slowly because I started in BDSM and then I slowly have become more like an escort or like a luxury companion. I guess I just had been trying on that hat and was already doing it.
Mm,
Yeah, I wasn't like a hardcore dominatrix before, and then I just switched and suddenly it was like,
mm.
yeah, going to the theater or whatever.
It was more just about aligning your branding with what you were already doing. Yeah.
Exactly. It was more of who I was,
Mm-hmm.
who I am. Because I think that it's like one of these fascinating things in this world that I think some people have a really strong persona shift, like between their everyday life and who they are at work. But I think that everyone kind of becomes themselves.
That's another thing I wanted to ask you about because
Mm.
different sex workers, I think, experience that differently. Some of us, like me, I feel like I'm just myself.
Yeah.
Like Lucy Huxley is just me. I don't feel like I can create a character and be someone
Hmm.
else. But I know that some workers do kind of create a character and have a persona that they are for work that maybe enables them to have more qualities that they long for or that are better suited to doing work.
Like
And
a lot of queer women, I feel like
mm,
I noticed that, like a lot of queer women who are like just like massive dykes or something. Like, and then at work they have this kind of femme alter
yes.
ego.
Yeah, because that type of marketing can help them get more bookings and more money and
Yeah,
yeah.
and I think it's like cool for people who have that divide. It seems clean to me, and it's actually also how I was kind of taught to be in this world.
So you kind of started by doing that and have you shifted away
Yeah,
from that or how has that been for
I
you?
mean, I think it's also being a dom because when you're a dom, you're kind of like a superhero.
Yeah, there's a bit of you're on a pedestal.
It's
You're
theatrical
viewed as above when you're viewed as above someone else, you're viewed as above human, which is dehumanizing in its own way, I think.
for
Or it can be.
sure. Yeah, but it's just more theatrical
Mm.
coming from that, and my name was very that. Yeah, whereas I feel like Sienna is just more relaxed and
Yeah.
yeah. And it's not that dominatrix like I'm on.
Yeah, it's more just you, I guess.
Yeah, I would say that she's like a more like a focused version of myself,
Mm,
or she's more, it's hard to say, but I wouldn't say it's me.
okay.
I wouldn't say it's 100% me. 'Cause it's obviously there's things that you bring out
Yeah.
or you choose to show. But yeah, as far as branding goes, I guess it's just what I think it should be. It's just like,
I love that. I love your
yeah,
branding. I
it's
think
my
it's so
taste
amazing. Yeah, you have
through
excellent
this
taste.
lens. Yeah. But it's nice to have this persona to kind of do these things that maybe you wouldn't permit yourself to do otherwise. Like
Yeah,
I do poetry readings on my
I've
Instagram.
seen. They're
Yeah.
wonderful.
And it's maybe my civilian self would be mortified.
Yeah. No, I get that. I can
Mm.
imagine if I were to do that on my personal private Instagram, that would feel so cringe.
Yeah.
But when you're doing it as a luxury companion or a
Mhm.
dominatrix, that's something completely different. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just like, how would I do this three-piece lingerie situation?
Yeah.
It's kind of fun when you get into it and you just
Mm,
kind of surrender to it. Yeah.
that's nice. Surrender to it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of fun to be had in that.
Yeah, because
Mm.
you can play with things that you wouldn't allow yourself
Yeah,
to.
yeah.
Nice. The last thing I want to wrap up with is what are the most meaningful relationships or experiences you've had with clients?
This is an interesting question because I feel like it's changed with my rebrand.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of going back to that a little bit, but I feel like since the rebrand, I've really kind of let loose on just charging a lot for my time
Nice.
and also being softer, as we said. And it's almost like since that time and showing more of myself, I've just been kind of very surprised at the level of affinity I've had with my clients. Because, yeah, when I was like holding back more or kind of being more rule bound by what I thought people were dictating to me versus what I kind of just think it should be in myself,
Mm,
I started to show more of myself and more of my taste. And the people that have kind of come out of the woodwork have been very surprising. Would never have imagined. Yeah. And that's really special. It's like becoming more specific actually brings you better opportunities to connect and have meaningful
mm,
experiences. It's also a fear like when you're kind of raising your rates, there's a fear that maybe you're going to lose some clients that can't afford that or wanted something kind of yeah, just wanted kind of a less engaging kind of experience. But actually, it's been kind of interesting to me that I've had more in common with people since I've done my rebrand, and they're like seeing me in lots of ways. So I guess that's still developing
mm-hmm,
because it's been kind of recent
mm-hmm,
that I've changed all that up.
mm-hmm.
And I've got people that I've known for a while who have come with me and through the different
So
iterations.
you've had clients from like before the rebrand who you're still seeing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. But
Have those client relationships changed at all with the rebrand, or has it stayed pretty much the same?
always developing.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I still do everything that I used to do. And it's also like you raise your rates and then people are like, well, yeah, I'm going to meet you there. So that's cool as well.
Yeah, that's really
Yeah, that's
nice.
like showing that level of like respect and valuing your time or just your presence in their life.
Yeah, yeah, it feels nice to be valued in that way. I recently went through the experience of raising my rates, and
Mm,
yeah, it felt so nice to have clients meeting me there. And
yeah.
yeah,
It's just whatever you're asking for is what you should be asking for. And if you're not comfortable with that, then you should go higher.
I love that.
Mm.
That's perfect advice.
Honestly, I feel like I'm having positive experiences all the
That's
time.
amazing.
Like yeah, since changing my name, I find it so sweet and rewarding, and people are so interesting and like generous, and I just feel like spoiled all the time. And I love that I get to go so deep with people because I think in my personal life, I gatekeep my pussy. I gatekeep myself so intensely.
In what way?
I just need to know that they're coming from a really good place. And this is like one of the ironic pitfalls that I think people who aren't in the industry have to go through when they're dating, which is people coming from a place of respect. Whereas I feel like with my clients, they're seeing my online presence, they're seeing a much more elaborated version of myself, and also choosing to remunerate me for my time and my efforts. And of course, in exchange, I'm showing up to those relationships with less needs than I would in my
Mm-hmm.
personal life. It's like
Mm-hmm.
more kind of streamlined with less strings attached. So that's the transaction as I see it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in my personal life, I feel I gatekeep for the same reasons where I'm like, okay, well, you're not going to see I'm not going to have a website,
Yeah.
but I'm going to be careful about who I'm engaging with
Mm-hmm.
because in some ways dating has less checks and balances to this other thing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, there's a lot of guys who just want to who are kind of selfish.
Yeah, they don't want to give you anything in return, or they're not thinking about what they're going to give you. They're just thinking about what they want from
Yeah, and
you.
how to get it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm like have been like unsuccessful dating or anything like this, but I just think it's interesting comparing. You almost have a recipe for meaningful things because you're showing more of yourself at work. You're kind of setting the terms in a lot more an explicit way.
Yeah, you're explicitly
Mm,
discussing what each of you wants and is going to get from the situation, and you're showing up
exactly.
ready to give that. Whereas in like vanilla or normal dating, you don't do that.
Yeah, and I would say that like most relationships like in this society are transactional to some extent. I think that's kind of the lesson of it's like sex work feminism. It's like that whores and housewives thing. When you're from this world, it makes you kind of more specific about how you're navigating those things, for
Yeah,
better or for worse. Mm.
all relationships are transactional, and it's just
Yeah,
about whether we're upfront about it and talking about it or not.
totally.
All right, I think we're going to end with that. Where can people follow you if they want to keep up with you? What platforms are best?
So I'm Sienna Carlisle on every platform, but I
Hmm.
think the Instagram has a dot in the
Okay,
middle, so it's Sienna dot
I'll link
Carlisle.
everything down below as well. Yeah, so you're
Perfect.
mostly on like Instagram and Twitter.
Yeah, I have a newsletter as well where I share like erotica and stuff.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, because who knows what's going to happen with social media next few years.
Yes. All right, thank you so much for joining me in my bedroom.
Thank you. This is lovely.
Thank you. I'm Lucy Huxley. I'm a whore, and thank you for joining us in my bedroom.